we're beginning to see momentum behind political parties, smaller political parties forming because of this gap in the, to the right of the centre. Let's just call it that. And that's going to come up in the general election. Isn't there a possibility there that if they get it right, if that were to become a common policy position, we actually want to empower the Irish people again. We want to go back in principle to what happened in 1922 and implement it, because we never again want to see the National Chamber manoeuvred in the way that it was manoeuvred this week. And it wouldn't be the first time, but in this particular case, it was about handing over control of the borders to the banal bureaucrats in Brussels.
Definitely, I think if that was a policy position, and I do know obviously the party Direct Democracy Ireland, that was obviously their main policy position, as I understand it, was to bring back direct democracy to the people. I think there are potentially, well, obviously there are no political parties at the moment that are advocating for that type of...
Well, they certainly wouldn't. It would be like the turkeys voting for Christmas, wouldn't it? Especially for those, the incumbent, Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil, and of course the Greens, the rump of the Greens, to form a coalition, are certainly not going to agree to something like that.
Because, as you said, they're not actually representing the people. They're doing, I think, an awful lot of our laws now obviously are created, drafted, implemented, signed off in Europe. Sometimes I wonder what we're actually paying our politicians for. And I believe between their salary, their allowances and their expenses, they're on maybe about 170,000 a year. So once we increase the Dáil seats from 160 to 174 in the next general election, the TDs are costing us, just for that alone, not even including their pensions and whatever other committees they might be on, they're costing us about 30 million a year. And if they're actually outsourcing their legislative function to the EU, what are we paying them for?
It's a very good question. But I was just to focus on the differentiator. So if the National Chamber wants to hold on to all these, what I call pretty arcane manoeuvres about how the Dáil operates, and would see a significant threat to their power and privilege and position, if the people themselves can organise their own their own votes on key issues, like, for example, the Immigration and Migration Pact, and other things like the bank bailout, and all of these major decisions that are simply made through the party whip system. That would be a big differentiator, wouldn't it, between the fledgling parties coming through and the existing political parties, because they would be completely alienated from one another on a crystal clear point.
It definitely would, but I think one of the issues that you would have is the type of parties that would be willing to propose that type of an initiative are probably the type of parties that couldn't actually get access to the mainstream media. So the public at large wouldn't even know that this was one of their policy positions, because the media, who I believe at this point are nearly controlled by the government, the media wouldn't let that information get out into the public, because they want to maintain obviously control with the government parties as it stands at the minute. So that is the fact that we don't have an independent, well-financed media is a significant issue in trying to break through to the middle Ireland.
But there is a bigger issue there, of course, in that the leadership, the medical leadership, the press leadership, the government leadership are the same leadership that pulled us through the 3 years of COVID and all of the stuff that went on there. So I really don't see them softening their position, because they're protecting themselves, especially now from the significant level of data that's coming in globally about the impact of all of this on public health everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how do you see that playing out then? I know it's a political question, but I'd be curious to see what you think. How do you see that playing out in the up-and-coming general election? I mean, the carryover from the refusal of the people to go with the commentariat and the political establishment in the constitutional referendum, which was very, very significant, and then the big growth, the big swing towards not voting for any particular party in the independent swing in the locals. How do you see that moving forward? Because you were just saying there quite correctly that the media are very much pro the establishment position, and clearly they're not covering the momentous events this week today in the national newspapers, and I don't expect they'll be covered tomorrow in the Sunday newspapers, which is absolutely extraordinary when you think it through. So how do you think it might play out then at the general election?
I think I think an awful lot of people say, and I would agree, that the local election isn't an indicator of how the general election will go. An awful lot of people, and I know from hearing people on the ground, an awful lot of people were saying, well, you know, I voted for this guy because he came to my father's funeral, or I voted for this guy because he got traffic lights down the end of the road. So it's very much, you know, local community. So it's not necessarily an indicator of how things are going to go in the general election. I also think that the 8th of March referendums on the family and the home, I don't necessarily know that those referendums were a win for, you know, the centre-right. I think there were an awful lot of people came out that Middle Ireland would consider to be respectable, and then that made it okay for them to hold the same opinion as those people. Whereas an awful lot of people, when they're talking about the likes of, say, the immigration issue, they'll kind of whisper it. They still kind of think there's something wrong with saying that, you know, we should have a cap on the number of people that we bring into this country because we only have a finite number of resources or limited resources in the country, and that those resources should primarily be devoted to the people of this country, the people who pay the taxes, the people who have actually built this country up over years. So I think there is still a cohort of people that will kind of whisper that, so they still don't feel like, even though they might go and have it, you know, in an independent poll or a confidential poll, they might say this is my view on immigration, but they're still not going to go down, you know, and talk quite openly about it. But you would hope that once they go to the ballot box, they will vote in accordance with their view on it. I think one of the problems that we do have is that the people who are, say, the centre-right, those parties, they don't get, as I said, an awful lot of media coverage. So an awful lot of people don't even know who these people are. Like, I know I've spoken to a good lot of people who, before the local elections, I was saying to them, how are you voting? And they were saying, well, I'm not happy voting for the government because I don't agree with them on this and this and this. And I said, well, who are you voting in the alternative? And they said, well, I don't know that I have anybody to vote for. And then I mentioned a couple of, you know, the parties that I might consider that I would have voted for. And they said, I've never heard of them. And the reason they've never heard of them is because they can't get onto the mainstream media. So even if the people who would maybe agree with some of our views, even if those people wanted to vote for parties, I don't think a lot of the time they even know who to vote for. And as well as that, I think there's somewhat of a fracture between the number of parties that are out there. And an awful lot of people are calling for some level of unity between the parties so there isn't a split in the vote and that there aren't too many people running. But I certainly think that if it was possible to get some kind of a level of cooperation between those parties, there is a potential that we could get people elected. And I think that's something that those groups, I would hope personally, would be focused on for the next general election.